Your next speaker, the stars certainly lined up for him. In fact, 4 stars lined up, and they landed on his shoulders. 4-star retired General Barry McCaffrey served in the United States Army for 32 years, ladies and gentlemen. During that process, at his retirement, he was the most highly decorated serving general. If this afternoon we talk about all the awards and accolades that he's received over his career, we'd be here for quite a long time. But go ahead anyway. I'll tell you what I will do. I want to talk to you about just about 3 categories of awards that he's received, which I think tells the story about the character of the individual that's going to be speaking to you in just a few minutes. He is the recipient of 3 Purple Hearts. General McCaffrey is the recipient of 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, and is the recipient of 2 Silver Stars. After leaving his military career, General McCaffrey became director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, where he worked to continue to protect all of us in this room this evening. He has been recognized for his distinguished and meritorious service time and time again for our great nation. He currently is a national security and terrorism analyst for NBC News. I got to meet General McCaffrey a few years ago after hearing from so many of you about the dire circumstances on your property and how porous our border was, and wanted to reach out to an expert in our nation, someone that could tell your story. And General McCaffrey certainly did that so very well. We know about his prowess on the battlefield, but I'm here to tell you, the battlefield of ideas, he is just as fierce because he takes on challenges head on. He is highly respected. Let's give a warm South Texas welcome to General Barry McCaffrey.
By the way, I always kid the person who introduced me and say it's the second best introduction I ever got. And I go on to tell a true story of my son introducing me to about 1,000 young officers in a military training course, Command General Staff Office. And they told me he had introduced me, and he cried and sniffled and tried to get out of it. Very embarrassing to stand up for a lawyer friend to introduce your dad. He called me, I said, "Shut up, you adult." So he walks out on stage and reads through painfully. He reads through painfully every word in my long bio. At the end of which he says, "However," he said, "I want you to know that I have worked with this great man for more than 21 years, primarily years of lawn and automotive maintenance, security issues in Canada, Mexico in particular, doing international security issues for better part of 19 years. That's the most coherent, straightforward, sensible presentation I ever heard bar none." Whoever wins the next election, whether it's Mr. Trump or whoever, I intend to propose you as Secretary of Homeland Security. By the way, Sylvia mentioned, how much impact does technology have on border apprehensions. I was very proud of bringing, during the 5.5 years as drug policy director, bringing lots of technology to the border. Some of it we borrowed from, international arms control monitoring agreements. We had giant X-ray machines, yada, yada, yada. Just before I left office, I had a huge conference in El Paso, border security conference, and 3 days, 1,000 people from up and down the border, and just before the conference was over, there was a giant bus, let's say 20 metric tons of pot in a couple of huge trucks, industrial level, disguising this pot in the walls of the truck. And so there was a big press conference, and they asked me what it was all about. And I said, well, we were starting to see the payoff of technology on the border. The actual story was a 18-year customs veteran sitting there at 100-degree heat with gas fumes stuffed into his nose. A truck pulls up to his inspection station. The guy hands out his paperwork. His hands are shaking. He says, "Are you carrying drugs today?" And the guy says, "Not much." So at the end, at the end of the day, it's experienced law enforcement professional backed up by good technology and buttressed by other tools that result in more secure borders. Lots of other people. Vernon, thanks very much for the invitation to come. Susan Kibbe gave me a giant tutorial over the phone for an hour, which is extremely helpful. I come to the border all the time, primarily to learn, to listen to people that are encountering the problem firsthand, whether they're in law enforcement or living on the border. Thanks to Joe Maley. Joe, where are you? Raise your hand. He took me out to dinner last night. We ate a 28-pound chicken fried steak. Joe's done a lot of good work for the state of Texas over the years. I had breakfast this morning with John Hoover, you here, district attorney. Another insight, when you talk to law enforcement, you don't talk about people wearing badges and carrying guns. You talk about a system. And you simply can't dramatically reinforce law enforcement without taking into account prosecution, jail system, probation officers, the whole package. And certainly Texas and all four of the border states have seen a lot of that. Deputy Benny Martinez and I testified jointly within the last year to a Senate hearing. He's here, Al Payne, thanks for your service. I've known you over the years, and the many others of you who have been part of my educational system working the border. For 5.5 years as drug policy director, I went up and down that border. Always in the month of August, I took 100 some odd officials from around the federal government. We met local officials on the U.S. side. We had the Mexicans have a matching presence on their side of the border, trying to understand and recommend common sense solutions to providing security along this frontier. It was a huge effort, resulted in some good. But I've got a ton of slides. Maybe we'll flip through them. I think not. I know they've been provided in postage stamp size form. You can get them on electrons, I'm sure. Susan can make them available for you. It's sort of the standard presentation that I update periodically. Lots of numbers in there. The numbers are probably correct. It's astonishing how much trouble it is to tease the truth out of the government over time. So maybe we'll walk through some of the slides. Let me make maybe 5 major points. Point number 1, and you don't need this lecture, but I give this, whether it's at Harvard University, the Kennedy School, or the Chamber of Commerce or Rotary Club, sort of a Socratic message when I ask them, who's the biggest trading partner of the United States that we encounter? Who's the most important economic partner? Is it China? Is it Russia? Is it the European Union? What is it? What's the answer? Number 1, bar none, is what? Canada. Absolutely. And then depending on how you parse the numbers, and they change a bit over time, but as a general statement, number 2 is Mexico. And when you bag us all together in this NAFTA economy, when you see tremendous improvements in general on the flow of people, ideas, resources, capital across these frontiers, it's been a tremendous asset to the United States. Talk about China, vital to our future, right? What percentage of our foreign exports goes to China? Give me a percentage number, somebody. 1%. But when you're talking about the future of America, you've got to understand Canada, Mexico, the northern tier. Our oil comes from Venezuela, Mexico, Canada, and the United States in general. These are vital economic aspects to you and I. I was at a graduate seminar at American University the first year as a drug policy director, and it was clear to me that one of my provocateur aides in the room questioning me didn't know where Mexico was. It's just astonishing. So I would underscore at the beginning the economic, cultural, law enforcement, tourism, national security issues involved with Canada and Mexico. And they're different, you know. You know, I always ask that, you know, I was up in Minnesota, Canadians to raise their hand and say, you know, you people are just like us, except you're not armed. There's a difference. And that Senate hearing we just had, Todd, it was astonishing to me. An unnamed senator came in and essentially questioned why we were only talking about arresting criminals on the Mexican border instead of the Canadian border. I said, you know, it might be a little safer living next door to the Vatican, but I doubt it. Canada's probably safer. But we do have this completely disparate way of dealing with these two frontiers. One of them gigantic, 5,000 miles with Canada, barely observed by U.S. law enforcement. You can drive 18-wheeler trucks across the frontier and sign in under the honor system in some places, and mostly it works. Our problem, by the way, and we even try and provide security in the Canadian frontier, is we suffer an immediate, disastrous economic bubble of stopping cross-border trade. Mexico and Canada are different, but I got to underscore one other thing. We actually like these people. And by the way, an observation I've made, working this issue for 20 years essentially, is Texas has a completely different relationship to Mexico than the other three border states in a variety of ways. And it's changing the last several years, and partially because of some of the things Sylvia mentioned. There's a general statement. There's always been an atmosphere of cooperation and affection and living together. And if you look at the border, U.S.-Mexico border, the people live 25 miles from that frontier on either side, like each other, a lot better than they do either national government. So there's always been a reluctance to see the border closed down, to see a Berlin Wall, to sever families. You know, I go to Fort Bliss, Texas a few years ago, and the commanding general's aide-de-camp, this beautiful young woman, 24 years old, West Pointer, captain, U.S. Army, born and raised across the river in Juarez, went to school in our side of the border. So there's been a tremendous sense of community in general between these companies. And by the way, we had another thing, and I hope this resonates with you. As a general statement, if you're dealing with a Mexican business, and you've been dealing with them for 20 years, they'll do what they say they're going to do. You can trust their word over telephone or a handshake. The Mexican institutions of government are a different thing, and we can talk about that. So Mexico and Canada are vitally important. Number two, second observation. You know, I spent a lot of time with an engineering design company doing very complex bridges, tunnels, airports, interstate highways, etc. And our young engineers, 6,000 of them, routinely run multivariate analysis of problems. If you're going to build a modern bridge, it's a pretty complex undertaking. We have two problems, and Sylvia mentioned this on the U.S.-Mexico border. Number one is we have to secure the borders, and number two, we need a rational immigration policy. You got to do them at the same time. You can't choose one or the other. And indeed, when we talk about securing the borders, fencing, technology, and intelligence, the intelligence system that we have on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq is immeasurably better than the intelligence system we have to see 20 miles into Mexico on who's forming up and who the cartel figures are. We got some real challenges on securing the border, and there's very much common sense to it. And by the way, fences are good. You know, one of the Texas ranchers told me a few years ago, Barry, do you ever see us try and keep our cows in with a virtual fence? You know, when you put up a barrier, you force people to go around it, under it, over it. You give time to the defenders. Fencing does have a position to play in this whole effort. The Boeing thing was an utter disaster of brilliant people doing stupid things year after year. It's just incredible. Could you build a fence, a physical barrier along that frontier? It's child's play, for God's sakes. It'd be a $4 or $5 billion effort. It'd be 3 or 4 years. We have more sound barrier fencing around most cities than is represented by that kind of a challenge. But of course, it wouldn't be enough. The former DHS Secretary, Janet Napolitano, a good friend of mine, said you put up 70-foot fence, you're going to have 70-foot, 1-foot ladder. That's deceptive. You've got to have fencing as part of that package. And by the way, second observation, thank God for the men and women of the border, Customs and Border Protection now. When I started working this issue, there were 4,000 Border Patrolmen, if I remember, in 1996. Now we're up to 21,000. And I've told 4 attorney generals in a row, the right answer is 48,000 men and women in the Border Patrol. And they'll look aghast because it's programmatic, budgetary. By the way, people in Washington don't give a hoot about strategies, white papers, authorizations. They care about the money. They fight about money. But most of the attorney generals and most of the people on the Border Patrol will always react badly and they'll say, well, General, what are the analytical underpinnings of 48,000? Underpinnings? I just made it up. That's the number of people, max strength, in the New York Police Department, charged with protecting 8 million people in a fairly confined area. And by the way, is that an insensitive political statement, not taking into account budgetary pressures? The Department of Defense has 2.4 million men and women in uniform, active guard reserve civilians. And by the way, I would argue, when you look at percent of GNP spent on defense, it's the lowest percentage of GNP spent in any of our so-called wars. If you bind the war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan, the global effort is a war. So when we look at many of these federal institutions, whether it's Customs and Border Protection, the public health system, the diplomatic corps of the United States, the Federal Marshal Service, the FBI, they are anemic, tiny organizations. And many of them have the wrong doctrine, strategy, force structure, training systems to do their job. The Border Patrol is completely inadequate to actually take on this challenge in a sensible way. That means an air component. That means a maritime component. That means your own training centers to try and form an institution that responds to the needs going forward in the coming 25 years. But we can talk about that in the question and answer. Second, rational immigration policy. You know, my grandparents on both sides came here to Ellis Island drunk, and they did okay. You know, I look at the situation, and sometimes the public utterances, Mr. Trump and others, are just phenomenal to me. I know you know this, but I remind people, look, if you actually could bag up 12 million people in green tape and ship them back where they came from, which of course is laughable as a proposition. But if you actually did this, you immediately kill the U.S. agricultural system, meatpacking, daycare centers, cleaning areas, etc. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. One of our economic advantages over Europe is immigration from the South. We end up with people that are culturally attuned, they're hard workers, they're spiritual people, they're humble people. That has given us a tremendous advantage as we look at global economic competition. We don't want to send 12 million people home. We do want to enforce the rule of law. That's our challenge. So we've got a couple of things we've got to sort out. And by the way, Sylvia, you know, the motto of any good infantry officer, like me, is frequently wrong, but never in doubt. So I've got an answer. And, you know, it seems to me you got to do two things. One of them is quite obvious, that the workers need to be able to get a permit, come across the frontier on a bus, wire their money home to their mother and not get extorted by Mexican border authorities, come and go. And by the way, when they're here, if they brought their children, their family, they need access to schooling systems, OSHA safety standards. They need to be able to go to the law enforcement and say, I'm being extorted by my worker. And I would argue that I think both political parties have been remiss in not grabbing that initiative. It is shameful that we would benefit so greatly from these populations and not regularize it in some sensible way. We do need a guest worker program. We need to register people. We can do this easily, for God's sake. From a lot of us in the room, our global entry for flying on planes or TSA pre-check approved, or for that matter, having a pass to go in and out of a university. With the technology we have today, this is easily doable. You don't have to, you can tell every post office, for God's sake, go to the post office, fill out a 3-page registration certificate, get your iris scan, get a photo, get 2 thumbprints electronically, and you're in the database, and then we'll give you temporary identification. That doesn't mean you're a citizen or you can stay. At the same time, you got to control the border. You do have to have people coming only through legal immigration points, or a lot of things will happen. By the way, one of them would be a disaster in Mexico or Central America, and we're on the verge of it. If you push 10, 15 million people in the United States border communities in a given year, which is possible if you have no control over your frontiers, it would be a huge problem. We're going to face the same thing when Fidel dies, within 36 months of him dying. We're going to see 1 million, 2 million, 3 million Cubans trying to get out of there. So that's point number 2. Point number 3, we need a serious engagement with Mexico and Central America. And Sylvia made the argument correctly. I don't know of a more foul, dangerous place in the world for those poor people than in these 3 countries. It is astonishing. The murder rate, the injustice. Law enforcement are uniformed criminal organizations who prey on the people. And we're diddling on the edge of this. The DEA has been hampered in their own operations in Central America by U.S. government constraints. I don't use these numbers to argue against other U.S. policies. At the height of the Iraq operation, we were spending $12 billion a month on operations in Iraq. By the way, to remind you, we've had 59,000 killed and wounded in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's been a real war going on out there. At the height of the Afghan operation, it was running around $10 billion a month. Mexico, our great strategy, $1 billion 4 years. Completely lopsided misunderstanding of where U.S. national priorities should be. You can't buy Mexican law enforcement integrity, operational excellence, etc., but you can certainly play a more central role in what's going on. So I just think U.S. policy has tended to be pathetic in a resource manner. There's no serious attention to the problem, and there's no coherent strategy. Point number 4. It's been you almost have to tread lightly how you speak about this. I think by far the most effective programs I've seen here in Texas. But when you look at border communities, and a border community now is Salt Lake City. This is not a problem. It's stuck within 3 miles of the border. If you go to any of the major American cities now and look around, and I always go to Department of Justice reports, there's probably 1,000 cities in the United States where there's a serious cartel presence. There may be 250 cities in the United States where they are the dominant criminal organization in America. So far, and Sylvia's quite correct, the mafia started in the 1920s shaking down fruit carts and gradually worked up to prostitution and bank robberies and extortions, and finally and reluctantly got into drugs. The cartel started with drugs. They're going to become polycriminal organizations increasingly over time. So if you legalize pot all over the United States, a remarkably bad idea, you're not going to stop the cartels from their absolute predatory behavior, primarily in Mexico, but also in the United States. So we've got to have some kind of federal support, it seems to me, the local law enforcement, in particular on communities that are directly impinged by cartel activity. And I think that applies certainly along the South Texas border. Final note, we got to reform the criminal justice system in the United States. There's a lot of talk about, picking on you, 2.2 million people behind bars, biggest population on the face of the earth. Most of it state and local level. Some of the local prison systems are as horrible as anything you find in a third world country. It's just astonishing. We put young boys in there and they come out worse off by far than they went in. And there's a lot of ways you get at that. And Sylvia mentioned education. But without sounding like I've gone soft in my elder years, I don't think you can simply solve it by arrest, prosecution, incarceration. I look at the amount of money we're willing to spend on probation officers, for God's sakes. We'll pay for a phenomenally expensive prison system. We won't pay for the reentry courts or the drug court system, or the ways to maintain law and order and to get people back on tracks. You look at high schools and grade schools, where's the money for music programs and football programs and lunch, that sort of thing? Those programs end up saving you $28,000 a year for local lockup or $50,000 a year for a max security lockup at the federal level. So we've got to sort out the criminal justice system. It doesn't make a lot of sense right now. You people have paid a lot more attention to me than my family does. And I tell people, I'm on periodically on NBC TV. My two grown daughters, now in their 40s, will call me and provide substantive feedback when I get off air. So the cell phone will ring and say, Dad, that was a great interview, tie, makeup, lighting, substantive kind of feedback. The girls, true story, 5 years ago, I'd been on air all day. I was at 30 Rock in New York City. They were both at Yakima, Washington, the center of the universe. And I got a call right after I got off here at 8 o'clock at night on the East Coast. And an older daughter said, Dad, both of us girls just loved your interview. It was just terrific. I said, well, I've been on all day. Which one was it? I said, Dad, we don't know. We always turn the sound off. Susan, thanks very much for the chance.